Let me just grab some more real quick. Is survival for nice speech? Okay, got some water. Can you guys hear me? Mic check. Okay, that's great. Quick, what this debate is about is would we rather live in a society where there is equality, that is to say everybody has an equal chance to participate in a society, or is there going to be equity? Is there going to be more equality or more outcomes that are going to be similar and there's going to be less divergence in that? What we as opening government stand for is an equal chance for people to participate into the society, and we don't care so much what the results are going to be. So first, two definitions about basic, two definitions. What are basic needs? So basically what let's say we're going to allow you to be able to survive and to participate within the society. That means, for example, that you can have access to food and water, but also healthcare, that makes it mean that you can exist, but also education, meaning that you're able to get a job. I think that those are the kind of deals that we're going to talk about. I think at the moment that those are going to be supplied, and then we're fine with not restricting the outcomes of the deals. And secondly, we're still also going to know that economic inequality is fine. However, we can still put in regulations or put in efforts to try to make sure that social inequality by discrimination and unfair chances are still outside of this debate. That is to say that we are fine with the government standing in there because we think that the most important thing is the ability for individuals to go into society and take part of that. And I think that that is what this debate is about. Okay, clarification from OO.
Yeah, so given that the CA clarifications chat stipulates that basic needs are met on either side of the debate, could you give us some sort of consideration about like where this new money would be going? What do you think the trade-off is?
Okay, I understand POI, I'm 2 ESL. So what I'm going to talk about is first principal point, and then I'm going to talk about why free markets are good. Okay, principal point. Basically, the state should only give you the ability for individuals to take part of that society and not then take away some of people's capital they've acquired just to give it to other people, even if those people get happier from it. So, why is that? Two reasons. First, know that you as an individual have a very limited responsibility to the state, because you firstly are literally have no control over where you are born. That is to say, it's quite literally a birth lottery, whether you're going to be born in the Netherlands or whether you're going to be born to Africa. You have no specific responsibility in the state that you are towards, simply because of the fact that you have no way to actually control that. The only responsibility that you can have is then to make sure that individuals who are born are then actually able to be part of that society and therefore able to participate in it. And we think that therefore that is to where it stops and isn't going to be any further to make sure that any individual can go there. Secondly, also note that you also did not consent into being born there. Therefore, you also have no ability for you to even maybe not do that or maybe go anywhere, go else. So let me take an analogy. So if Daan is going to see $5 here on the table, he is not allowed to take it just so he can buy a book and he can be happy. Even if I do not notice it and I don't get sad from it, we still in general think that it is wrong from Daan to take them $5 and make himself happy. Why? Because it is my money, even if I don't know it. However, it's worse on the direction of the house, right? Because instead of Daan just taking my money without knowing it, he's using his military and he's using his monopoly of violence to make sure that I give up that $5 so someone else can buy a book, right? So we say that the extent to which you are able to provide people a life to exist in, that is fine, but you are not allowed to go any further because you were unable to consent to be being born into society and you have no responsibility towards your state. Okay. Secondly, you also note that the state towards you also doesn't have any ability, has no responsibility, right? Because the state is also in this relation where they also did not really consent into you being born or you being in their state. That is to say, the only responsibility that the state has towards the individual is also just so that it can subsist, that the state is only allowed to make sure that it can exist in a form, and the only way that it can do that is by making sure that individuals can partake in society, but not any further. So then what is the consequence of this? First, note that principally, you only then have as a state are allowed to actually make sure that people can partake in society, get some education, get a job, and make sure that they can exist and be able to buy food and then water so that they can survive or get healthcare. But also know that you then as an individual are allowed to have the capital that you have acquired from your hard work. If you invested in yourself, if you took the risk to start a company, to work all those hours, to go through all that education, all that effort that you have put in is then to your spending. You can do with it if you want to. You should be able to do that. Okay. So then, principally, we say therefore that the state only has principle is only towards that. But besides that, we also think in general free market capitalism is good. I will give CO a POI.
Isn't individual participation very arbitrary? Because there's multiple externalities and structural reasons that determine people's participation in society.
Okay, then we think it's even better because at the moment you're able to participate in society, that in general means that you are able to get an education and can do to some extent what you want and be able to actually get a job to make sure that you can actually stay alive and you have ability to have healthcare. So at the moment that the individual then has the chances to do what he wants, and that at the moment he's partaking in society. So like that is the general form of society. If people interpret it a different way and choose different jobs, that is fine, but it is not anything that's going to be that much difficult for us and the government side. Okay, so then why is free market capitalism in generally good? 3 reasons. First, know that governments are always too slow to react to economic crisis. That is to say, it happens is you're basically going to get, you have less spending within the economy, you want to get it up. So then what does the government do? It tries to actually minimize this and try to say, okay, we're going to spend hugely, we're going to try to reduce inequality that way to get a lot of money from the rich people, let them pay taxes, and then give it to the poor people so they can spend it within the economy. The problem there is, however, it always stays too slow, but also note, however, that at the moment they're going to be in those highs, and they're much more difficult for them to even to get through that, because at that point, they don't want to be the party who's then also going to tax them, basically meaning that you as a government are unable to actually help these conjectures and able to do that. Secondly, also know that they actually don't help the general people, right? Because the most people that actually can get by and actually don't pay taxes, for example, or don't hold the rules or by laws because they can find little holes they can swim through, is basically the big companies. They can do that. However, the average person still needs to pay a lot of, still needs to pay taxes, still has all those rules, still has the inequality that they need to pay for. However, the uber rich don't get it. That's to say, the state, even if you're going to have this idea of if inequity being bad, then you're still going to need to take into account that the rich people will always get away, and therefore you're unable to support that, meaning that your principal leg has nowhere to stand on because you're unable to make sure that those companies and those people are actually paying the taxes or doing the due deal. So we even think of this principle, you're unable to provide that. But first, we also know that, for example, the overcomplication of taxes, etc., makes that you as an individual have less money to actually go and spend that money for yourself, but also that working sometimes is just more expensive than not working and taking the welfare money. So we therefore think it's in general much better if you then have a free market state. I'm so proud to propose.
I'd like to thank that speaker for that speech. And now to open the case for the opposition bench, I'll call on the leader of that side.
Our case in opening opposition is very simple, which is that a life with sustenance is not a life that can be fulfilling and happy to any meaningful degree. The only way to achieve this is a world where people have maximum agency, where they're actually to fulfill their preferences in a meaningful way, which is something that in a capitalist world will always require capital. Therefore, the point at which a state has any duty of care, they therefore have a duty in order to maximize people's agencies. So just bringing on a new principle is that, look, an agency is what distinguishes me as a human being from an object or an animal. It says that I as a rational agent am able to make decisions about my preferences and able to access whatever degree I want. Therefore, in order for governments to be able to respect my agency as an individual and respect my human dignity, they need to take any sort of means to be able to maximize their agency, which means a world without any sort of extreme equality, a world where people have some access to some degree of capital and able to fulfill a meaningful life. Look, so the key piece of framing in this debate is that the reason why this can only happen with the government is, one, the state is the only necessary actor and able to achieve or give yourself any sense of agency and reduce inequality. Why? Because one, they only act with the capital in order to do so. Two, they only act with that information, which means that they know exactly where that capital needs to go in order to reduce inequality and give people meaningful access to their lives. And thirdly, they also have the institutions available in order to distribute that wealth. They have things like taxation, they have things like the welfare state. They're the only meaningful actor that in any meaningful degree is going to able to redistribute wealth and give people the wealth that they need to access their preferences. But also, secondly, and important to note, there are many reasons why individuals under status quo cannot access any form of capital by their own means and therefore need a state to do this. But also also clashing therefore with opening government's case that just, oh, people can just participate on either side of the house. Look, bear in mind the point at which many people are born in through the lottery, like for the birth lottery, they are confined to systems of very poor education, which often means they are never able to meaningfully rise up against the government because of that lack of education. And often it means that the capital you are born with is a main determinant of what sort of success you ever have in your life. Often things like racial or gender barriers, it means that unless you have capital, unless you have privilege, unless you have contacts, you're never going to be able to participate in a meaningful way. Meaning even just because you have food and water and a roof over your head, that doesn't mean you as an individual have any form of agency or you can meaningfully participate in any like society in any degree. And therefore only that government that has that capital and the resources, the means to redistribute that wealth, therefore has that duty to fulfill that purpose. Just saying for why we think this will be effective distribution is that one, the actual capital that was required is quite marginal in this degree. We're just talking about giving people meaningful capital to be able to just like access their preferences and living a life that they want. Also, secondly, the point at which there is no trade-off because we on both sides of the house, people's basic needs are met. I think therefore you have a meaningful means to do so and able to redistribute wealth in a way that is equitable and fair. Because look, why do we therefore believe that survival is not the same as living? Therefore, why do we prioritize people's agencies? I think it's important to note that, as I said before, agency is what distinguishes you from any other form of animal or object. Therefore, it's assault on human dignity for you as a government to not respect people's agencies and not allow people to have the access or the capital in order to access their preferences to do so. Because I think, look, why sustenance is not enough is that, one, it's important to note that your conception of happiness is very, very comparative. So even if you live in a world where everyone's basic needs are met, I think it's very likely that you as an individual are going to become complacent. I think you no longer see value in things like food and water. I think it's something that you begin to just take for granted if it's something that everyone just simply has. That everything on like a utilitarian metric, it just kind of reaches zero. I think it's something that is no longer a meaningful source of happiness in people's lives because it's something that just simply everyone has. And then on top of that, and secondly and more crucially, is that you see everyone with a lot of money in the world and huge amounts of inequality that currently exist today. You as an individual may have your basic needs met, but you now compare your happiness to like Jeff Bezos or even just like the other rich people that live in your city. It doesn't even have to be that extreme. And therefore, I think you'll never be able to meaningfully feel fulfilled or have happiness in your life when you're constantly comparing yourself to people that are far more privileged and far more wealthy than you. I think it's also important to note in the context of wealth within a capitalist system is that wealth is often seen as a metric of success because one, wealth is often glorified in the media. I think it's often seen that as something that is incredibly desirable and something that everyone should meaningfully access. Two, I think it's often seen as like a status symbol. The point of which something that is tied to your labor, and we live in a very materialistic capitalist society. I think it's something that's always going to be seen as a system of power and wealth. But also thirdly, I think the point of which have like a pick yourself up by the like a bootstrap mentality as a society. I think when you don't have money, it is often seen as your fault. I think you are seen as a failure and you either lack the ability or lack the talent or lack the education to ever do so. And it's never seen as a consequence of structural barriers. I'll take CG. CG?
Do you think a world where everyone has equivalent agency and a world where you've maximized agency are one and the same?
Because equivalent agency, if that agency is very low, it's still very little agency. Because I think, look, what happens is after your needs are met, what will happen is you get diverging preferences, which are things you have to access through capital. I think most people, especially in a capitalist world, where literally just everything costs money, anything that you want to meaningfully access requires just basic sustenance in life. You have to have some form of meaningful wealth or just some form of like wealth to begin with in order to be able to access your preferences, have any form of agency. If you're just a person that can literally just afford food and there's nothing else you have at the end of the week, there's not any form of meaningful preferences that you are accessing as an individual. You're just fulfilling your basic needs and living a life of sustenance. Therefore, I think the point at which people have diverging preferences, people have interests, people have hobbies, people have things they like to buy because it gives them happiness. I think that is something that is perfectly valid and something that people should be able to pursue. And I think it's something that government should be able to ask people in doing so. I think secondly, also what your next point of need is after you have like your basic physical needs met is often you want an ability to do things like foster relationships. I think it's often something that also requires things like surplus wealth. Why? Because you need to often pay money to travel if that person that you want to see lives far away from you, or maybe you have to pay to like go to socializing places like the pub to meet people, or maybe just have like internet access to be able to meet people online. This is another example of something that is often very in touch with people's preferences and happiness, but often requires some form of surplus of wealth to be able to meaningfully access any form of relationships that just aren't literally like the people that live next to you. I think it's also to point that, look, states have no conception of what gives people happiness and what gives people in the world. Therefore, I think even if it's something small, like maybe you just wanted to buy your child a toy for Christmas that year that you otherwise couldn't afford. If that is something that gives meaning and happiness to people's lives, I think that is something that is absolutely valid and something that we cannot judge therefore. Therefore, I think the state is not an actor that has to dictate what your needs are as an individual. I think if your needs are something that are emotional as well as physical, I think that is perfectly valid. I think that's something that the state should also access. I don't see why duty of care literally just goes to a physical needs. I think your duty if you have a duty of care, I think that extends to both your emotional and your physical well-being, because I think we all recognize that you can't just live a happy life if you just have your physical needs met. I think every human being has emotional needs that they also need to be met. Therefore, I think the point of which, I think it's just therefore a good thing on our side if people are able to have some sense of agency and able to meaningfully access the life that they want to live. I think the point at which humanity is just contingent on your entire agency and what distinguishes us from anything else. I think that's something that needs to be respected the most out of all this debate. I think life is so much more than just having like food, water, and a roof over your head. It's about having to like meaningfully access the things that you enjoy and the things that you want in life. Therefore, all these reasons, we're so proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank that speaker for their speech. And now to continue the case for the government bench, I'll call on the Deputy Prime Minister.
Mic check, am I audible? Before I'm gonna start with my speech for the people that are watching, to be clear, I'm not defending my own opinion. This is an assigned position I'm currently defending. I still want to have some left-wing political career, I hope. Buzz off, Ron. I realize how happy I am that round 5 was not recorded. Cool. Look, panel, I think it's quite funny that opening opposition stands up and tells you that the state does not know your preferences. At the moment that is true, I think that state has no fundamental right to intervene with anything of this, because it will always be a guess whether you make other people not happy, whereas Piotr proves to you why you will always inherently make someone else less happy at the moment that you strip them from their ownership. What I'm going to do is briefly crush the principle of agencies. Then I'm going to explain why the principle of ownership is the only thing this debate should be judged upon, and then weigh that off. Let's first do some brief household, because I think the LO just blatantly ignored Piotr's speech. Firstly, we tell you we still fight social inequality. That is to say that discrimination and stuff, we're perfectly fine fighting those, nothing on that in the info slides, perfectly fine. Secondly, we say basic needs are met for everyone, and we think that at the moment that you have access to these, that's the only thing that you are obligated to give back to the state. That looks like having clean water, having basic healthcare, having basic education, and those kind of things. That being out of the way, let's talk about agencies. Before I'm going to dive into any of the single mechanisms, I think this is the most important thing. Agencies and needs are infinite. That is to say, I can have all the money I want. I can spend my week with all the money exactly in the way Georgia wants. I think the problem with that is that I will always compare myself to someone who is slightly bit richer. That is to say that even if they can say that agency slightly increases in their side of the house, I think that is an incredible marginal increase. That is for the simple reason that I can have lots of money. I can drive the fastest car. I can have the biggest house. I will always want more. I will always see something in my house I'm not happy about. I will always say, look, maybe I want a car that drives a bit faster. I will always see someone who is slightly a bit faster than me. Therefore, I think agencies is simply non-comparative within this debate. But let's dive into the actual mechanisms they give. Firstly, they say government should maximize those. I think at the moment that they are met, the only thing that you have to do is give the basic needs, because those are the things that everyone has a base level of agencies. We think that's more than enough to do. Secondly, you say, oh, but people get jealous. Look, I don't think jealousy is ever a legitimate claim. Look, I can be very, very jealous of the way that Ron can run principal cases. That doesn't mean that we're going to ban Ron from running principal cases within rounds just because I don't like it. This is for the reason that Ron has worked for it and gave a lot of workshops for it. This is why we still run human dignity and why it somehow became a thing in BP debating. Love you long time, Ron. That is to say that secondly, there are all other kinds of things that you can be happy about that are not material. You can still be very happy with the job that you have. You can still be very happy as a high school teacher. Not all things cost you money. You can have your friends, you can have your people, you can do the things you like. We think at the moment that the state does not know this, and what your preferences are, they have no right to take it from someone to redistribute in a way that they see fit. Briefly, Parv.
I cannot feel the effect of everyone else's participation increasing slightly, but what I can feel is my own situation being dramatically worse.
yeah, and I can also feel my situation going drastically worse at the moment that I take my money away. I don't think that at the moment that you give the agencies to anyone in any equal way, then good luck defending communism where everyone has the same rights, because that's literally your burden then. Cool. Let's dive into the principle of ownership. What we tell you, where does this come from? We tell you that you have made this money. How did you make it? By frankly investing in yourself, by working lots of hours, by taking massive risks, by doing your best to innovate ideas and companies. We see that this is the reason that Steve Jobs got big in first place, because he had an innovative idea, because he found people together, and he did his best to actually get somewhere. I think it's not different from you than if I tell you I sell this pen to Reese. Reese at some point says, well, I want to give €5 for it. I think that's much, but regardless, then apparently this pen is worth €5. This is exactly the same as it goes for rich people, like CEOs, because we value because the value is in the perception that we have of people. This is why, if I want to pay a lot of money for a soccer match of FC Barcelona, then I think Messi deserves that money. Why? Because he actively he actually represents that value. He attracts sponsors. He attracts more people that want this. Therefore, this is his money, and we have no right to take it away from me. Others could have frankly done the same, because they to some extent had chances. This is, I think, the most important within this debate. Then both Partheny POI and Georgia in their speech say, but there are other factors, like the birth lottery. Look, one, you had the basic needs and you had the chances. You can also exploit your talents in a certain way. If then talent is too arbitrary, then again, op should stand for basically having no difference in outcomes at all. We think that that's basically then the burden. I wish them good luck. Secondly, we still say we fight for social equality. We think that is not really relevant within this debate. Then what can we ask from these people that made this amount of money? What we only think we can ask from them is that they provide others with the same chances as they had, namely those basic needs. And we tell you that those are met. They have healthcare, education, clean water, etc. But we think that other than that, you cannot ask anything from that. The question is then, do we want to guarantee the outcome, or do we want to guarantee chances? Opposition then has the burden to explain why we have to guarantee an outcome, despite anything what people do with the money that we give to them, despite anything of the chances they give you. We think, I want to say that this is basically theft, namely you steal money from the individual. We are fine allowing you to act as charity. We think lots of the rich already do this, but no one can coerce you to do this for two reasons. A, you do not consent to this. I did not consent to go to a certain state, and I also just can't move to another place because, where it doesn't exist, because they are frankly very limited. And oftentimes these places don't exist. B, you don't actually have any say where the money goes. Let me give you an intuition pump here. At the moment that a poor person goes to my house and tells me, give me 30% of your income, I think I don't have an obligation to say, yes, here you have it. However, on the opposition side, that person will say, if you don't, I'll give you a fine and you need to pay both. At the moment that I say no to that, then they say, oh, we're going to bring guns. I think it's all clear to us that this is something abhorrent, and we can never allow anyone to go to my house, threaten me with violence before I give my money away. We think this is the exact same what opposition stands for, namely the state does this, but then on a very massive scale. If I want to say no to that, they bring violence. We think this is inherently wrong. What is the weighing in this debate? Then briefly, we tell you that the differentiation from animals is symmetric, because we have a right to agency. We think also humans are unique in having a right to ownership. However, we see that the difference is who has worked for it and who has the right to do it. We think that only you yourself have the right to do this. Now I'm not really proud to propose, but you get it.
I'd like to thank that speaker for their speech. And now to close the top half of the debate, I'll call on the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Cool. Could I check that I'm audible?
You are, yeah.
Okay. Speech starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, humanity is not sustenance, but rather humanity is my ability to access the things that I value, which necessarily is contingent on my ability to access surplus capital. Recognize that Maslow's hierarchy of pyramid thing doesn't stop at the bottom thing, but rather it recognizes that individuals have other needs which they require to be fulfilled. Unfortunately, due to the society in which we currently inhabit, one which is contingent on material things being valued, valued, one which has cost factors inhibiting your ability to access relationships and things which you value socially, be that travel, be that internet. Recognize that what all of this means is that our ability to access any of the things which we consider fundamental as an aspect of humanity are contingent on our ability to access capital. Therefore, we do not think it is enough for basic needs to be met, given that this is one, something that happens on either side, and two, opening government haven't provided a trade-off, but rather we think that we are better to exist in a society whereby we have current mechanisms like welfare giving people the capacity to access agency. The reason why typically people find food stamps abhorrent is because they consider them to be something dehumanizing, whereby we determine that an individual is incapable of making a decision and designate that upon them. The reason why we would often choose to live in a democracy rather than a dictatorship, even if that met our needs, is because we as individuals want the ability to impart our decisions in the world around us and access the consequences of this. We think our capacity to make decisions is contingent on capital, and subsequently we ought to give additional capital. One clarification on what we stand over. Like, we're not taking all of the rich people's money. I think we are probably fine to just have progressive taxation. Given this, I think this does two things for the rest of this debate. One, I think it massively mitigates opening government's principle of ownership stuff, because I think at the point at which the capital that rich people lose is super marginal to them, but this aggregated across all of the people currently locked out of making decisions is pivotal to them accessing a quality of life. We think that that massively diminishes their case. But responding to closing government's weird straw manny POI, recognize that I don't think either side in this debate is able to access equivalency or agency maximization, but rather your ability to exhibit agency is comparative, and we think your life is materially better off if you are able to make one important decision, or you are able to put some money away for you to make a decision about your child's life. You want to get them a toy, you want to go on a holiday, you want to do all of the things that are formative to human experience and identity, which we consider intrinsic to the human condition. I'm going to do two things in this speech. One, contrary to what my usual meme case strategy is, I'm going to prove why taxation isn't theft. Secondarily, I'm going to explain why agency ought to be the metric you should default to in this debate, how we comparatively maximize it. Cool. I have broadly 7 reasons as to why taxation isn't theft. 1, recognize that their ability to justify this is contingent on them proving that this access is sufficient participation. I think George's analysis has already cast a substantial amount of doubt on that. And so far as often our ability to participate in things like governmental systems is contingent on our 1, mental well-being, 2, ability to travel, 3, access to things like literature or education or social relationships with other people, which determine me to determine my preferences. Given this, I think the human condition is too complex for opening government to claim that sustenance is sufficient to access this. Secondarily, I think opening government are contingent on capital being justly acquired in order for their principle of ownership to work. 2 reasons as to why that's unlikely. 1, recognize that mechanisms like tax evasion and inheritance mean that often the capital which people acquire has not been that which is earned, but rather that which is generationally hoarded. 2, often people at the top of companies have accessed this position due to the labor of their workers, meaning that in these instances it is unclear why these people don't also have a right to ownership of those. Recognize this doesn't take out opening government entirely, but note that their burden on the principle of ownership was absolutionist. All we need to do is prove that there are sufficient instances where this doesn't exist and it is justified to tax them. Thirdly, recognize that I think at the point at which the state creates the conditions by which this capital is generated, the state also has some ownership of this capital and it is legitimate in taking some. Recognize that rich people are able to get wealthy off of the economic conditions within the state, the educational institutions that have allowed them to rise up, and the fact that the state facilitates the activities that they are doing to generate the capital. Given that the state is responsible to some extent for them in generating that capital, we think it is legitimate for them to access it. Fourthly, we think, as I have alluded to earlier, the capital that they lose is minimal, therefore the harms to their ownership are also minimal. Fifthly, the thing that we get regarding opening governments, that people don't consent to this. Two problems under this. One, I have no idea why this consent matters, whereby the individuals who they have harmed through practices like poor labor laws and colonial extraction also didn't consent to the practices that have got them rich. At best, consent is symmetric, and I am unclear how you should adjudicate it. The way in which you ought to break this deadlock then is that, one, I think opening government's case is just a problem with democracy, and the way in which you ought then adjudicate this as legitimate is that the state is the aggregation of the preferences of everyone within it, meaning that at the point at which the state's decision represents this aggregation of preferences, it is something that is legitimate and garners an aggregate degree of utility and ought to be considered legitimate and positive. But secondarily, if you want to weigh this on a utilitarian metric, recognize that the deprivation to individuals who possess this ownership is comparatively minimal because their conception of capital is vastly reduced, whereas on the comparative, the minor capital that individuals who possess none access is important, because I want you to paint a picture of what someone whose basic needs with no money looks like. Georgia has analysed to you why these people are structurally shut out of accessing jobs and capitals due to the fact that they have poor education, due to the fact that they are confined to specific geographic regions, meaning that their life in opening government's world is that they have sustenance and then they do fuck all else, because I am unsure how much happiness you are able to access at the point at which you lack capital to enter spaces where people socialize or access things that make you happy. Given this, I don't care if in opening government's world it's never going to be enough. Not everybody is going to be Jeff Bezos, but debating is comparative, and we think of the point at which we grant individuals the capacity to make more decisions, they live a closer approximation to what their conception of a good life is, they are greater able to access for conception of what we believe to be humanity, and ultimately we think you ought to respect the comparative maximization of agency you get in opening opposition.
I'd like to thank that speaker for their speech. Now to open the back half of the debate, I'll call on the Member of Government.
I hope I'm audible.
Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. Dear panel, two things coming from closing government. Firstly, the principle that is actually engaging with opening opposition and like dealing with their best case, why we think that taxation actually is theft. And then secondly, dealing with why we need inequality to actually achieve maximal agency within the world. If that's the burden no one wants to prove, we are winning on this. Before that, just a very quick clarification on the comparative, and that also engages with opening opposition. Notice that the goal of opening opposition, when they talk about agency, and the examples that they themselves bring are stuff like, oh, but I want to be able to go on holidays, I want to live a meaningful life. All of those things are things that presumably would require a significant amount of wealth redistribution in order to achieve that. So if their own burden of agency is things that people live a very meaningful and good and rich life, I think that what also follows from that is that the wealth redistribution that like Jason wants to characterize as marginal for the rich people isn't actually as marginal and needs to be very large scale. I think that at that point they lose their comparative that, oh, but the harm to these rich people is very small. But I think that furthermore, they just need to engage with the reality that there's going to be a massive difference in the way you create policy. That is the comparative in this debate. Let's talk about the principle. And I think that this is all stuff that like opening government misses. They try to flag it by saying, oh, the birth lottery, and that's why some obligations exist. I think we're going to do it better. Firstly, I don't think that like we don't consent generally to the state, but we do so under the veil of ignorance that we get security from them, i.e. the difference between me living under a state and living stateless is the fundamental security that the state is offering to me. So to justify the state having a monopoly over me, then I think that the only obligation the state has to fulfill is to provide me security. I think that the fact of having basic needs met, i.e. I have access to security, or like I have access to food and water so I don't die from those conditions that harm my security, or I generally have access, for example, the legal system existing that protects my security, are things that is the fundamental obligation to the state. The state doesn't have any further obligations. I am unsure why OO wants to frame into things like agency, because I don't think that the difference between living in a state, like under a state, and living stateless is like a fundamental change in agency. But furthermore, even if it is, I think that like generally taxation can be theft if it crosses a certain threshold. Why is this the case? I think that overall within a society, we have a belief that compensation should come for things like work. I think that this exists simply that many people, like, I don't know whether in judging we're like, you shouldn't do free labor and judge for free, but generally, for example, we think that slavery is bad. Even if you provide good accommodation, you should still receive some type of remuneration for it. I think the tax is justified as the work we do isn't entirely on our own. So I agree with Jason on that fact. I think the reason why that is the case is we rely, for example, on the work of others, and we rely on things like the state providing infrastructure. So if I'm a shipping company, I rely on the state having built things like infrastructure and roads. What follows from that is the state is legitimate in taking at least some portion of that work, of the money I am, or the compensation I'm earning from my work, but not more. So I think that the larger portion of the work that I still do is still my own. If I don't know, build something on my own, so I still owe compensation for that thing, and tax beyond that is theft. I think that rich people are part of the state, and probably Jason is correct, they have been exploiting to some extent and have caused a situation in which people aren't in positions of security where their basic needs aren't met. I think that up until to the point that people's basic needs are met, it is also fine to progressively tax people until that point. I think anything that goes beyond it goes beyond the state's obligation to provide people security. And from that point on, I think that it is taking away people's right to the compensation for the hard work and effort they put into. I think that this engages with the stuff OO brings to us. I don't think that they're like agencies even is as works as a principle, but secondly, I think that agency is still guaranteed to you on a level in which you're able to actually meaningfully live your life, in the sense that you do have access to all of your basic needs, and that is the fundamental level that creates you agency. I think OG deals fairly with it by saying that like we can limit everything else in terms of like social inequality and stuff. No, thank you. I think that the second thing we're going to win this debate by is, even if agency is the most important thing, why we get it more. I think that the fundamental change that like massive inequality creates, and notice it is important to understand that the change OO wants to implement means that you're going to take lots and lots of money away from rich people, otherwise they don't reach their impact. What this means, I think that rich people are uniquely able to do things like blue skies research within the society. These are things that advance the society. What this means is that these are other large projects, or like generally large projects that would require billions of dollars to do. The likelihood of payoff is very small, but the potential payoff that you would get if a project succeeds is something that is huge. For example, imagine, I don't know, being able to live on Mars or other very far off projects. I think that these are things that the state will fundamentally never be capable of doing. The state has to justify still wherever it has to spend its public money. So I think that if you would say, oh, we are spending $5 billion on the like 0.01% chance of ever reaching Mars, I think that no one would ever actually sign up to that idea, and these governments get voted out. At that point, the state has no possibility of engaging in it. But secondly, they have already taken the policy of eradicating economic inequality. At that point, presumably, they don't have any money left to do any of this research. I think that rich people are in a unique position when they're not constrained by any of those abilities, and they are in a unique position to do any of this research. Why does this matter? Firstly, in terms of automation, I think the full automation is currently far away because it requires lots of blue skies research, and is only possible and likely in the near future if we allow people like Elon Musk to pour their energy into it. I do think that they have the incentive to do it as rich people. For example, one, Elon Musk probably has like a personal incentive to be the cool guy who invents shit, and he just has a fascination for going to Mars. But secondly, I think that these are also people who would in the future would not want to do work. I think that full automation is the only way to actually maximize agency within this world. If that's OO's burden, we are winning it. Why is this the case? I think that having to do work, any type of work within any society, is the thing that fundamentally strips your agency and your possibility of choosing what is the better thing to do with my time. I think you're fundamentally always going to be constrained into a situation where someone is going to be your boss and you have to follow some orders. I think that if that is taken away by possibility, or even if we have at least a slim chance that there might be so much more agency in the future world, I think that we are winning this debate, and I think that life would be good. Like, I'm not expecting any zero responses that automation creates inequality, because presumably still under that world, all of the basic needs are still met under the policy of this motion. But secondly, I think the mechanism of reducing inequality in like socially also works. Secondly, climate change, why this matters. I think that there is a high chance in this world that climate change is actually going to kill all people. I don't really think that any of the top half impacts matter if people are going to die. I think that there are unique ways and how we are going to be able to like change this situation. I think that one, probably just have like significantly higher ability to do any of the type of research that leads to like carbon reversal or climate change reversal technologies. But more importantly, I think that is something that is a train we have already missed. I think the more important thing is we need to, I don't know, get light speed fast travel so we can go into space and live our life there, or we need Elon Musk to actually be capable of colonizing Mars and translate our human lives there. I think this is the biggest impact, because if humanity dies out, none of the impacts that any of the other teams bring matter in this debate. I think for all of those reasons, closing government wins the debate.
I'd like to thank that speaker for their speech. And now to continue the case for the opposition bench, I'll call on a member of opposition.
Well, actually, yeah, can I not be recorded, please? Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1.
Izzy, sorry, could you just wait a second? The recording is still going on. So if you'd like to not be recorded, could I get the tab person to just pause the recording?
Oh, it's fine. If I can't do it quickly, I'll just start my speech anyway.
Cool. Can you hear me and see me?
Yeah.
Cool. If you're curious, I am on bed. All right. Cool. 3, 2, 1. First, responses to, I guess, CO's case, and then dealing with OO, why we win, and then finally comparing ourselves to OG. First, CO's case. So I'm slightly confused. One of their claims is that once you are able to meet all basic needs, you're going to regress back to a society where basic needs are no longer met. Importantly, a few claims here. It is one, once you establish basic needs as a basic thing that each and every person deserves, it becomes much more politically fucked up to try and attack that specifically. As in now this becomes an absolute right that each person should have, right? So when we abolished slavery, we didn't go back to slavery because there were no more people suffering from slavery and we thought, oh, that might be a good idea and go back. Once specific principles are established within society, it just becomes incredibly, incredibly hard to regress. I think if we do start regressing, people probably believe that progressive taxation is justified again. I think Treaty explicitly gives you the reasoning for why progressive taxation is justified when basic needs are threatened or harmed. I think we get away with that quite easily. The second case is lots of politics is gonna happen. I'm just gonna respond to this based on very quick things. One, the Green Party exists. It mainly campaigns mainly on things like climate change, etc. They presumably still exist in the future. They aren't necessarily damaged by all of this. Secondly, that specifically you have more unity among the left and right, and therefore you have less of rich people lobbying against all of the left's policies. People generally believe in things like utility. As long as their own wealth isn't something that is specifically trying to be harmed, you probably get more policies that other people care about, right? Because the main thing they are specifically against is their wealth taken away from them. As you get more unity, as you get more preference aggregation, because you no longer have that clash of aggregations happening in the first place. I'll take a quick POI for
Clear. Our world is that the money that now goes on needs status quo now goes as surplus money. The rich lose no money, but if we value physical well-being, we ought also value emotional well-being and grant people the capacity to access their happiness.
Okay, I'm just gonna move on to OO first of all. So really should have taken my POI, and I think this might be slightly cheaty, so up to you panel to decide. Importantly, the motion says, each and every person gets their basic needs fulfilled. Importantly, that means people who are absolutely doing zero amount of work or incapable of doing work or anything, those are the people whose absolute basic needs are met. Importantly, one, this is a large amount of work going around, right? To distribute basic needs to literally each and every person. But also secondly, what it means is the economy is probably doing well. Importantly, what it means is there is a large amount of jobs available, but also that as long as you are better off than literally the worst person, you have a level of surplus money coming to you. The amount of surplus money you have is presumably then proportional to the amount of work you're willing to put in. Meaning, as in, if your OO's entire case is people don't have surplus money, that is untrue. The thing they have to stand for specifically is equality of income. I think we're able to some degree to get away with people have surplus money. More importantly, on the principle, why I guess I do OG comparison first, because we both run the principle of taxation is theft. But why is ours more complete? one, ours stands, we give the explanations for the obvious attacks upon the principle itself. As in panel, right now in status quo, you probably think progressive taxation is fine. You probably think some degree of taxation is also fine and just. Trino gives you the explicit reasons as to why that is acceptable. As in the amount of work that you're doing, there is an explicit component that you yourself are putting into it, and the measurement, therefore, of how much should be taxed is based on that. So likely attack would be, but you can never guess the exact amount of taxation that is not theft or theft. We say what is just simply acceptable is specifically that you tax the amount, that you just tax with intent, right? As in you have an intent to go, I am specifically going to take off the amount of money that is how much work has been put in by the government by offering you education, by offering you roads, blah, 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 blah. And that's how much we're going to take away. Cool. The second attack is specifically, this wealth wasn't acquired justly, and therefore we are just in taking it away. Quite a few responses to this. One, this doesn't logically follow. Just because there is a morally arbitrary reasoning between me and the money doesn't mean the state has ability to take it away. What do I mean? For example, if I am father to a daughter, that it is entirely arbitrary that daughter was born to me. That daughter could have been born to anyone else. I could have acquired any other daughter. Importantly, that doesn't mean that obligations don't flow from me to that daughter, and it doesn't mean anyone can take that daughter away. Second thing to also note, if it is true that the government is suspicious that maybe to some degree that in your bank account that you have stolen some degree of money, right? They have some degree of probabilistic analysis, but they cannot prove it for certain. I'm pretty sure everyone would think it's unjust to take all of your money or to take a significant degree of money. As in, we believe in a level of principle fairness. Importantly, you are now taking money from lots of rich people, but you do not prove necessarily that all of those people have committed unjust acts and therefore don't deserve that money. Sure, if they've committed tax evasion and are caught of it, we're more than happy to confiscate a large degree of their money. If those immoralities are proved, we're more than happy to take it away, and I think the government would be just in doing so. Importantly, given that we break that specific moral arbitration link, but also prove to you why necessarily the state has a duty to not specifically take it, because given that it is simply yours and you have ownership over it. Also additional things, the reason you have it is because you had parents who specifically worked hard in order to give you that money. Your parents specifically wanted it to you, and I think it's a just means of transferring of ownership. Importantly, if I give my child if I give my child £10, even though the child did not do anything moral to actually achieve it, it's still incredibly unjust to steal that money from that child, right? Even though it's no longer in my hand, it's in the child's hand. Presumably they go and like fucking spend it on candy or whatever. It's still unjust to steal it from them. Importantly, it's okay for transfership of ownership to exist, and therefore it is just that they have all of that wealth. Ugh, I need to like fucking brush my teeth after this. It feels disgusting. Anyway, next thing to specifically deal with. Fulfillment is incredibly arbitrary, as in I might not be fulfilled because I don't have access to, I don't know, the best fucking hentai in the world. I may not be fulfilled because I don't meaningfully find another person to form a relationship with. Importantly, capital is an incredibly arbitrary mechanism for fulfilling that specific things. We think the government is better able to do this. We also think the government has more money to give you greater agency and things like not dying of cancer. Cool.
I'd like to thank that speaker for their speech. And now to close the case for the opposition bench and indeed to close this semi-final as a whole, I'll call on the opposition whip.
Unmuted. Cool, thanks. Can I be heard?
You can, yeah.
Thanks. And I'll take POIs in the chat and I'll fish one from opening government closer to 6. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. panel, our cases are very simple. You'll be restricting the agency of people in the future when you cannot account for decisions like for like pandemics and health crises, when you cannot be resilient in the future, when you cannot justify progressive tax systems because you are just meeting basic needs because it's an absolute, like Arib just said, because you don't have any like political like ability, you don't have any political like will specifically to carry this on, which means actually you need to support and cushion people as much as possible, which I think co-opts all of flips all of closing government's harms onto us, dealing very, very quickly with closing government because I think I can largely absorb them within our case, and then dealing with opening government and then finally opening opposition. They say 3 pushbacks on our case. First of all, that you can meet basic needs because it becomes an absolute, right? But I think that Izzy already dealt with this already when Izzy said specifically that you need to maximize your preferences democratically and have the legitimacy to be able to do this. If all of government care about participation, then you should be allowed to exercise that as a right. Why is this the case? Because insofar as you hollow out left-wing parties and you lack direct accountability anymore, you cannot maximize your own preferences and you cannot get representation specifically for this. Insofar as economic inequality is the most important thing, and like that left-wing parties stand upon, then you can't be able to get any of that change. They glibly say, but the Green Party exists, right? Most people don't vote for the Green Party because they tend to be centre-left and not as radical, which means you lose a voter base, and you either get a lot of political apathy, or you just get them voting for the right wing or centre out of necessity, which means you don't actually get this change. I think that was a really bad response, and I don't think you actually get a lot of change for Green Parties anyway. Even in states specifically around the world where there's like largely radical parties, you still get like very centre-right and right-wing parties winning out with super majorities, literally like Latin America and things like that. Second of all, they say like, but you're lobbying less, which means the wealthy people won't care because their wealth is not harmed. But their money will be harmed by all of CG, what they're talking about. Insofar as they're collecting surplus wealth on their side of the house, specifically about like massive research that requires a lot of capital, full automation, and like climate change. Insofar as people are risk averse and side with the doubt, I don't think you'll be able to get political efficacy to pass these policies in the first place, right? Because people are proximate individuals. I think moral frameworks, I think you probably prioritize dependency and reparation specifically the moral framework than an intergenerational framework. Why is that the case? Because democratic mandate is given in the now, i.e. a government is only legitimate and a state is only legitimate from the democratic mandate they get from the people. Why is this important? Because you cannot assume people's preferences in the future, which means you cannot specifically use this money for the things that closing government was talking about, because you care about people maximizing their preferences in the now, which means specifically on moral like principles and preference maximization, I think we automatically outweigh them on democracy, right? Which means actually you are like coercing people on closing government to like not get any economic inequality, but also their money will be coerced into spending for these things which are likely to be very like low probability of chance. If there's like a 0.001% like Trinu said, then specifically why are you risking their money? Why are you wasting their money specifically? I think it's largely with closing government. I think we can co-opt all of their stuff on our side when our stuff becomes more legitimate, when you can maximize your preferences. I.e. if they want to do full automation and climate change, that is better on our side if they give you the democratic mandate to do so in the now, rather than relying on an intergenerational moral framework. Dealing with opening government. Look, they say in the POI that look, opposition bench is assuming that we know best and like we know best about these moral frameworks. I don't think we're contingent on on the stuff that opening opposition was saying, because opening opposition, I think we're just assuming that specifically that you need to maximize emotional well-being specifically to get the agency that you want. But actually on our side, if you can maximize your preferences democratically to vote in a system, i.e. this is the metric that government set up, i.e. participation within the system. If equal participation is your thing that you want to like prioritize, that's specifically of voting and things like that as well. So presumably if you can maximize your preferences that way, then that's specifically better, right? But why specifically you do not get equal participation on opening government? A couple of reasons for this. One, they say actually governments are slow to react, so you should leave it to the free market. Very full responses to this. First of all, wealth accumulation happens unjustly, which means that insofar as you are now prioritizing who can access the free market, even if you give them basic needs, you cannot prioritize the free market. Note all our analysis on resilience to the future specifically, which means giving people the ability to cushion themselves and try to access the free market gets better on our side of the house. But secondly, only people that can access the free market in the first place are the people who have a lot of wealth in the first place, who can cushion things like recessions, who can cushion things like slumps and booms, right? Which means that they will be unjustly acquiring wealth, which means the disparity between the poor and rich, even if basic needs are met, will keep going higher, which means you're artificially increasing quality to such a degree, which is unjust in the first place. note all of open opposition's analysis specifically on this about why inequality increasing isn't just in and of itself, but also they just I don't think many people can rely on the free market specifically, and I think that if the rich have like stolen from others and like have been exploited, you need specifically like reparations to do this, right? Insofar as you like the state has opted into things like Izzy said, like global governance and a development agenda, you remove the collectivization incentive on government, which is you remove the incentive for reparations. Insofar as these are now moral duties of the state, because the states have opted into the things like the UN and the EU, you now have the optics and the mandate specifically to fulfill these things. You have to fulfill things like essentialism as a moral framework, i.e. the ability to give people rights and reparations for like colonialist harms, which means it solves comparatively, or out of the house, some of the arbitrariness and the sort of the moral luck that people get in the round of birth lottery, which I think comparatively, even marginally, gets better on our side when open government specifically didn't deal with that. Okay, more responses. I think the only reason that the welfare state can be propped up with the free market is because of state intervention, right? Insofar as you abandon economic inequality, resolving that, you have no justification for collecting that progressive tax system, which means you cannot be resilient in the future, and you lack justifications for having progressive tax systems, which means that you cannot have state sovereignty and like self-defense and be able to give security and shelter, because states are always specifically asymmetric, i.e. some countries will be specifically structurally fucked over than other countries, which means you cannot specifically before time. I'll take OJ.
Okay, look, companies have the same interest when fighting future problems. Now you're also taking away their ability to do so. FE, in our case, has more money to research vaccines.
No, that's not the case. Specifically, if you are progressively taxing them, like Jason literally said, you are mitigating the amount of loss because it's no massive theft from them. Because if they don't like, this is another thing, if they don't like this progressive tax system in the status quo, they have moved. The reason why the rich don't can opt out of a social contract, sorry Reese, is because like they can opt out of a social contract specifically because they can just leave the state that they're in, whereas the poor people cannot because they lack mobility, right? If companies can't do that, they can just leave, right? And also this is like proportional specifically to, so I don't think this is specifically that. Look, I think therefore this exacerbates inequality because the government cannot solve it anymore. Okay. Finally, individual participation. Why do government don't access that? No time to wait, open opposition, but to be honest, they probably won the debate anyway. I think, look, there's a multiple externalities and there are like structural reasons specifically why individual participation varies. People are very heterogeneous, which means you need to be flexible with policy, you need to be resilient in the future, which means actually you cannot, because of the randomness and the arbitrariness, you cannot specifically have individual participation maximized for people because there's a random birth lottery, which means that a social inequality, which means that the state has already determined outcomes for you specifically when you can like practice the future. For those reasons, Op win this debate. Thanks.